Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next session of CME Palooza Spring. I am Scott Coburn, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome you to this session that is entitled, I Know the Answer, but What's the Question? And this session is sponsored by Platform Q. Our moderator for this session is Alex Howson. Alex is the principal at Thistle Editorial LLC. And I will bring her on shortly to introduce the rest of the panel. But before we do that, as with all of our CME Palooza sessions, I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors, our gold sponsors, Med Learning Group, Physicians Education Resource, and Projects and Knowledge, our silver sponsors, Peer Audience, Academic CME, the Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning, Integrity CE, Hippocrates, and Platform Q Health Education. And our bronze sponsors, Antidote Education Company, PVI, CMEology, Haymarket Medical Education, Vindico Medical Education, Medscape Education, RMEI Medical Education, Global Education Group, Real CME, Answers in CME, Helio CME, Creative Educational Concepts, Integritas Communications, Infograph Ed, Prova Education, DKB Med, CME Outfitters, Evolve Medical Education, Spire Learning, Red Med Ed, Foresight Learning, and Excalibur Medical Education. So as with all of our CME Palooza sessions, for those folks who are watching this live, you can use the Creative Educational Concepts text line to send in a question. The number is 267-666-0CME. Or you can tweet your question to us using the CME Palooza hashtag. We will get to as many questions as we can during this session. And finally, we will be using the Peer Audience response system during this session. It is through Poll Everywhere. You can either download the Poll Everywhere app and join the presentation entitled CME Palooza 005, or type in the URL on the screen in your web browser. And then finally, our speaker disclosure. Please note that the opinions, discussions, and/or conclusions expressed are those of our panelists and do not represent an endorsement by or a position of their employer, its parent company, or their affiliates. And so with that, I am going to turn things over to Alex to introduce our panel and get us started.
Thanks, Scott. Well, hello and welcome to our panel. I know the answer, but what's the question? So if you're a fan of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, you know the answer is 42, and you'll probably already have a cache of questions to support this answer. So go ahead and put them in the comment box or use the chat line to send in your questions to support the answer 42. I'm your moderator, Alex Howson, and I have the pleasure of introducing an illustrious panel this afternoon. With me are Kathleen Donnelly-Bensala of the American College of Cardiology, Mary Ellen Bellevue of Knowledge to Practice, Asma Ali of AA and Associates, and Charles Rossi, who is a freelance editorial consultant. We're going to focus on the role of blueprints in shaping the approach to outcomes assessments. We're going to focus on the value of self-assessment in lifelong learning, how to incorporate qualitative approaches to assessments, and how to write an absolutely fantabulous test question. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Kathleen to kick us off with the role of blueprints in outcomes assessments.
Super. Thank you, Alex, for that generous introduction. Thank you, CME Palooza, for inviting us to provide this talk, and thank you in the audience for joining us. Often, I can imagine if we could, as we are in our roles of evaluating and reporting out outcomes for CME education, we're often wondering how we assemble these blocks of information, and that is knowing that we have an educational offering and that we have different education formats with reporting needs and analysis and everything else that goes into putting this together. And how do we go about approaching that? And so with all these building blocks, I want to assure you that there is a way. And so I'm hoping that this talk, as we kick off this session, will help reinforce or provide new information for some folks that there is a solid way to go about this. And my first recommendation here is, as you think about an educational offering that perhaps you're working with just now, someone has approached you and said, this is what our team is going to do in the organization, and please think about outcomes and reporting with this. Where do you start? And I always say begin with the end in mind, as several of you probably do as well, thinking of Stephen Covey, et cetera. And that is, know the needs assessment associated with the educational offering. Know what it is, know who the target audience is, know who the stakeholders are, know what the educational gap is, because it's exactly those kinds of things that you'll report out on in the end. So knowing those things up front will help set the stage. And it is the foundation of one of those key building blocks for developing a successful assessment strategy as you go forward. The second piece of advice that I have here is good news. And some of this won't be a surprise for you, and then others it will be like, thank goodness. There exists a conceptual framework for planning and evaluating CME credit. I invite all of you to go and have a look at Moore's model, at Moore's et al., and there is this conceptual framework that's there. It is an article that was written in 2009, and there's been some updates since then. So be sure to check out the more recent updates as well. But there is a wealth of information in that document that talks about how to go about approaching the assessment strategy for evaluating education. And what they do is they've looked at the research, they've looked at some adult learning and how learning transpires, and they've incorporated different models to come up with and develop this conceptual framework. And in the end, what they've done, as you can see here on the screen on the right-hand side, is this pyramid, if you will, of 7 different levels of evaluating education. And so that's what I encourage folks to do, is to have a look and think about, okay, the educational offering, what's part of it, what's involved with this, and where do we want to evaluate? You need to ask that question first, is where do you want to evaluate? And then you get into the how part. Now, the good news with the how side is in that article as well, is it provides you examples of how you could evaluate education on that level. So that's there as well. So if you'll see here, level 1 is around participation, which we often associate with attendance, and satisfaction about, is the content relevant, or satisfaction, overall satisfaction with it. It could be engagement or other parameters that about it. And then we see about the learning piece, or knowledge, declarative, procedural, et cetera, all the way to competency and performance. Now, most of us in our organizations, we can evaluate up through level 5 easily. You'll see that with level 6 and 7, it's a little bit more engaging, not impossible, and something that we should all strive for as well. The takeaway from this slide is, know that there is a conceptual framework there, and it requires that a lot of planning, that some planning is done on the front end side. Next slide, please. So with that, as we continue with our building blocks, as you notice, we're constructing something over there in the top right-hand corner, it is helpful in the planning process to use some tools. And on this screen, what I'm providing are some tools, and that is a blueprint. A learning blueprint, as we refer to, outlines the educational activity. It includes the needs assessment and the statement of need derived from that. It includes the teaching activities, the learning objectives, what faculty will teach, learning outcomes, what is expected the learners will have, and you can even map it to long-term outcomes, et cetera. You can add different columns in there that could talk about, you could add your faculty column, et cetera. There's some keys with it, is to pay attention that everything is aligning, so that with your learning objective, you have your learning objective and your learning outcome, and then you could have your question format. Add a column in there about your question format, what kind of assessment strategy that you want to use, et cetera. You can do that. On the right side of the screen here is where we start building out the assessment strategy. You've identified what you want to evaluate, how you want to evaluate it, and what those pieces are. So there's these different tools. One of the key takeaways with this one is make sure there's alignment across everything so that when you get to the evaluation and reporting side, you can make clear statements about what the learning accomplished because it aligns straight across. Next slide, please. So another piece, and I can imagine that many of us have had this scenario, and that is when an organization has decided to move forward with an educational activity, say that it is, we're going to stream something live, and then we might then endure that project or product onto our website, etc. We might link it to hubs or link it to resources, etc. In this event, there are many different data sources or data formats, education formats that are being used. So my suggestion when you think about your assessment strategy is to understand what formats are being used. And so here, understand what the educational formats are and then what data can be collected from each of those. And you'll need to align those on your learning blueprint on that map so you have everything mapped out. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share with you quickly here is an example. It's like many of you, our organization at the ACC decided that we were going to provide education around the COVID-19 experience. And so what we did is we had a weekly activity. We used different education formats and we used different platforms in order to convey this information. And so our team was tasked with monitoring the outcomes and reporting these. And so you'll see here as an example, what I did, those previous slides, you'll see that I mapped everything out. I understood exactly who the stakeholders were, the target audience, what were the objectives, then mapped out the educational formats that were being used with the data sources, etc., to identify the assessment strategy and then implemented it. The outcome of that was to be able to provide data such as this. You see on the left-hand side that there's an explanation of the reach, including the audience profession and where they dialed in from locally and internationally, as well as then looking at other levels. So that reach is level 1. Then we get into level 2 and 3 here that talks about the satisfaction and engagement, like the educational formats, what the engagement looked like, etc. Next slide, please. Here is more information that was derived from that assessment strategy. It talked about time spent, hours engaged, etc. And next slide, please. And then this slide is highlighting learning outcomes based off the assessment strategy. So we used a survey that asked people questions about, after engaging in the activity, asked them questions, and we were able to provide learning outcomes with this. My colleagues on the panel will then talk about specific strategies here that I'm just touching on. Next slide, please. So as you can see here, pulling together all those different components will help you establish a successful assessment strategy. It all starts with that strong foundation of understanding the needs and then planning, using the blueprints, understanding your educational formats and platforms and how to consolidate that data. It's all rooted in that Moore's et al. Conceptual framework about how to go about assessing for outcomes. I hope this is helpful. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kathleen. Scott, do we have any questions from the audience while we're waiting for feedback from the chat line? I just wanted to kick off with a question, Kathleen. In reference to this slide in particular, you talk about consolidating data. Could you speak a little more about what your approach to consolidating data is, especially when you have kind of mixed methods and you have different formats across a period of time and so on?
Sure. So, oftentimes we use mixed methods with qualitative, quantitative, combining both of them. One of the key things is really to be a defender of data, if you will, and that is, as evaluators of education, is trying to insist as much as possible about having unique identifiers going across and each of the data sets. And because with that, so it could be, you know, a member ID number, it could be whatever source that might be unique in your organization, et cetera. That really helps because when you consolidate that information in your different analytic tools, you'll be able to use that unique identifier that then allows you to assemble and link these data sets together. That's my number one key for that, for consolidating data.
Right, and that's going to be particularly beneficial as well as you get into longitudinal data evaluation, I imagine.
Yes.
So Alex, we have one comment. So it's not really a question from the CEC text line. So the comment is, I think this is a good reminder that as much as the CME community thinks they remember or know what the Moore's levels and article are all about, it's a good reminder to go back and reread the initial article from time to time to refresh our memory so that we truly know what we're talking about.
I love that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Scott. I have reread that article many times, and I've been doing this for many years. It's just good, and I always start there. I map these things out. It's very helpful. It is a great reminder, and kind of nice to look at it once a year or so.
Okay.
All right, let's move on to Mary Ellen Bellevaux, who's going to talk about self-assessment.
I think you're muted, Mary Ellen.
That might pose a challenge. Thank you, Alex and Scott. Appreciate the invite to be here and excited to share with you a couple of slides. Scott, do you want to put up the quick first question?
So for those folks who are using our peer audience response system, if you can go to Poll Everywhere and please respond to the question on your screen.
Great. Oh, they're still coming in. Wow, we have a big diversity.
Okay.
Good. Awesome. So the very high people, you can chime in and help enhance any of the points brought forward. But my goal today is to start to think about assessments in terms of understanding adult learning and how do we foster best learner experience through our awareness and application of adult learning principles, and thinking about how we can leverage both formative and summative assessment tools to bring adult learning theory into action. So Scott, if you want to go to my first slide, that would be fantastic. So those of you who are marked very high likely know Malcolm Knowles, one of my favorite theorists in adult learning theory. He actually brought the concept of andragogy to us back in 1968. And he established, at least initially, they grew in time, but initially these 6 principles that you see on the left-hand side of the screen as being the principles that differentiate the way an adult needs to learn versus a child. So prior to 1968, we only had a thing called pedagogy, which is a very teacher-centric model. And post the acceptance of Malcolm Knowles' theory in 1968, suddenly there became a category called andragogy, andra meaning man, so adult versus child. And so you all have seen the barriers to change in behaviors as it applies to physicians. So as you shift your eye over to the right of the screen, I'm just reminding you of that visual that helps you always have perspective that as adults, our self-perception is not always accurate, specifically in the case of physicians. Physicians are expert learners and they have to be decisive at the bedside. So their level of confidence tends to be high. At the rate in which new knowledge and medicine is evolving, it's often difficult for them to actually be clear on what they might have missed. So you end up with what we have, these 4 quadrants, which are the worried well, so those that actually don't have barriers to change, accept their confidence. And our job as educators is to build their confidence. And as you know, assessments are very effective builders in confidence, right? Low need for knowledge versus low desire for learning is also a person that is performing well, and but they may get caught off guard when something emerges. So again, your assessments and engagement with those types of students can help them come to the reality that there are some things that are new that they need to catch up with. And you move across a 2x2 in such a manner. Obviously, our highest risk group are the folks that have a perception that they have no knowledge blockers and or practice gaps, and they have no motivation to learn. Clearly, assessments play a role there. To the eager beaver who has an accurate self-assessment and is actively working to fulfill themselves. As you think about each one of these folks, you can imagine how assessments help them to be able to self-perceive and focus themselves on the things that they need to know versus further enhance the things that they already know and are perhaps expert at. As expert learners, physicians will have a tendency to do the things that they're really great at and do more of them, even into the esoteric. This will help balance their learning behavior between still engaging in those esoteric things, but also making sure that they're brushing up on the things that they need to brush up. So Scott, if you move to the next slide. So what I've done here is I'm going to move through a couple slides, and they're all anchored on Malcolm Knowles' principles and thinking about how to leverage assessments across these principles in order to create perspective and focus and the ability and confidence to change behavior. So Scott, you can move to the next slide. So you'll see the 6 principles are at the core in that green core with the reverse out type. Those are Malcolm Knowles' principles. I like to start with the motivation to learn. You know, and for this first time, just to iterate how we're going to go through the next couple slides, the gray indicates children, right? So pedagogy. So the teacher defines what the child has to learn or what a degree candidate has to learn, right? What they have to do in order to pass a course. When postgraduate, when you're in your adult learning engagement theory, it's intrinsic, right? And so what we're trying to do constantly is think about the fact that so many physicians can sometimes get caught up in what they need to do and might end up with a check the box theory, like I have to get my CME or my MOC. So intrinsic means help them be aware that they're lacking in they have tons of mastery, but there's areas that they need to either learn about because it's brand new and emerging or brush up on because they don't engage in it frequently. And Scott, if you move to the next. So need to know is interesting, right? So the learner, not the teacher, really defines the need to know. So as a physician meets challenges, they identify they need knowledge and often engage in the search for that very knowledge. And we like to leverage both summative and formative assessments to drive their need to know if they're not coming to us with a need to know. Scott, you can move to the next slide. So, thank you. So, physicians don't want to be told what they need to learn, and they don't have the time to engage in learning things that they have current mastery in. So they're committed lifelong learners who need to be able to access micro-learning experiences that are relevant to their personal practice gaps at the moment in time. And if this is available, they will self-direct, and if done well, they will retain the new knowledge and engage it at the bedside and right away. And so when you think about self-directed, obviously the use of assessments helps that physician really understand the things that are changing and moving that they need to be engaged in. And so, Scott, if you move to the next slide. So Malcolm taught us about the role of experience, and this is something that we all know about. We've talked about this for over a decade now, that in order for a physician to take in new or emerging concepts, they have to integrate existing knowledge with that new knowledge in order to cement it in long-term memory and be able to retrieve it at the bedside. So what you have to do in order to do that is make sure you're enabling them to bring their experience to bear. That is what is going to help them move from knowledge to wisdom over their period of time. And so one of the things that we focus on is using formative and summative assessments to really help the physician understand it's exactly what is important to them. And the most valuable learning is referred to as emancipatory learning. It requires the teacher and the student to have equality. And through discussion and the sharing of complex experiences, expert learners elevate their knowledge together. And so thinking about how you leverage assessments for that both live and online experiences that bring the teacher and students onto the same plane and engage in questions and dialogue in order to move conversations into very rich directions and ultimately relate an emancipatory learning experiences. And Scott, one final slide. Not final, but one final of Malcolm Knowles' theory.
You have 40 seconds left, Mary Ellen.
Okay. Scott, did you want to move to the next slide?
I did. This is the next slide.
Okay, go one. Oh, it was stuck on my screen. I'm sorry. So actually go back a slide. And we can end on this slide. So this is really about shifting and thinking about the orientation to learning. So when you think about a physician, generally a challenging patient case or an objective self-assessment drives an MD to seek education. In this way, it's life-centered. It is essential lifelong learning is accessible 24/7 in these small, accessible GIST so they can access it on the go. And so that's, I guess, in the interest of time, Alex, I think I'll close there and see if there's any questions.
That's great. Oh, thanks so much for sharing that, Mary Ellen. I loved what you said about emancipatory relationship and learning. It reminds me of Bell Hooks and her work on education and freedom to our teaching to transgress. Education as freedom and education as absolutely tied to relationships and emotions and experience. So Scott, do we have any questions or comments from the audience?
Not right now. So yeah, I think if you want to move ahead to the next presentation, that'd be great.
Okay, we'll do. Asma, you are up.
All right. All right, so my presentation is called I Know the Answer, but How or Why is the Question. So what we'll be talking about today is using qualitative and mixed methods research to try and get at some of those higher evaluation levels of Moore's model and different ways you might consider incorporating qualitative and mixed methods work into CME. So we'll start with the poll. And I will say the "Are you kidding me?" is like the I haven't done it before. So I anticipate that most people may not have done a lot of qualitative, but it'll take a minute for people to respond.
Okay, I think we got the gist of it.
All right. So So hopefully it's still moving around a little bit, but I think we've generally got an idea. There's not, it's the, are you kidding me too? I've done it a little bit. So hopefully today I can convince you. I know we've done surveys for a really long time in CME, right? Surveys are usually the way we collect information. And surveys are great in a lot of ways, right? Like they're fast, they're fairly easy to design. You know, you can get feedback relatively easy on them before you put them out. Everything is sort of automated and online. Back in the dark ages, we used punch cards or mailed out surveys, and those were a little bit more difficult, but now it's pretty easy. But surveys aren't great at answering all types of questions, right? Surveys answer how much, right? Or how many, pretty much, in different kinds of ways. But if you have these other questions like how or why, or want to get a little bit more into the depth of like, you know, why things occur or where things might be going, under what circumstances they happen, qualitative is a good way to do that. Next slide. So this is a slide I lifted from QuestionPro, which is a survey tool actually, but it shows different kinds of qualitative methods, and really there's two buckets of qualitative methods, right? There are those things where you're talking to people, or you're talking via survey and people are providing information. So interviews, focus groups, ethnographies. And then the other kind of qualitative research that we do a lot in MedEd or in CME, where we touch on it, is case study research, record keeping, EHR, so any kind of document, process observation, so documentation based research, where you're looking at like electronic documents or charts or anything like that. So next slide. This is just, I know Kathleen went into this, but just as just to remind us, this is Moore's levels. And so qualitative can be incorporated into Moore's levels. I think most people here have probably used qualitative or open-ended survey pieces, but you can go all the way to interviews and get to the higher levels of Moore's models. So next slide, please. Ooh, that got... okay, yeah, let's just go through that. Okay, so I'm not quite sure what happened to this slide, but this, so this slide kind of shows how qualitative can be incorporated into Moore's levels. So the first three levels, I think a lot of us look at qualitative survey data, right? Your open-ended things, which actually sometimes have very rich information. That other category, or when you're asking people to explain how or why on their barriers. And in practice, I found like not a lot of people go back to that because that's tedious, right? So we just throw that other category and give the percentage of it. But really, sometimes there's some good information, or you can find out things, right? Like that you weren't anticipating. I think I did one recently where we asked about race, and several providers classified themselves as Middle Eastern, for instance, right? And that's not usually a racist category or like a race category, but we just found that we happen to have a lot of providers that self-identify that way. So sometimes you can find out some information about your learners that way. For competency, you could look at learning outcomes and case studies or case histories, right, are good ways to look at sort of whether people, what people would do in a case is a good way to get at level 4. And then for level 5, EHR and chart reviews are good. Rubrics sometimes help to see whether a learner has achieved certain levels of competency or performance. And then really what I'll be talking a little bit more in my case study is getting at that level 6 or 7 by looking at interviews, focus groups, other kinds of research where you're really getting into how does the physician incorporate, the physician or the provider incorporate what they've learned into their practice. So next slide. I'll be talking about Choosing Wisely, which was a project that I worked on when I was at ASCP. And Choosing Wisely, if you're not familiar with it, was an initiative of the Robert Robert Woods Johnson, and then ABIM also did some work around it, looking at unnecessary testing in particular. And so several medical specialties received grants from ABIM to sort of incorporate or develop knowledge among their physician providers on testing and like what tests are overutilized and how to sort of identify those tests and help prevent overtesting. So being the pathology organization, like testing is most of what our physicians do, testing and diagnostics. We did an education campaign around the 10 recommendations with the California Society of Pathologists. But to understand, so we used like very traditional CME. So there was the live education program, we had pre-tests, we had post-tests, we had surveys about participation and satisfaction, and even looked at competencies and stuff like that. But for the actual level 5, so performance, and then the impact of what we taught, we incorporated photo voice ethnography, which is a form of interviewing where you either take pictures, in this case we did video, but we had the providers we went to where they were and asked them about how they incorporated. So after they had identified the changes in practice and barriers they perceived, we circled back about 3 to 6 months later and basically said, well, show us what you've done, right? So, or tell us about what you've done, and can you show us, in your lab what that looks like? And, so people pointed to like protocols, people, pointed to procedures they had changed or brought in staff members who had, really changed sort of based on the recommendations of what was going on. So this was good in several ways because it not only sort of provided information about how they incorporated it in practice, but because it was a video and it was videotaped and then we turned that into like short segments, it really provided it provided an enduring material. So other people could kind of learn what was next. Thanks, I see you, Alex. All right, so this slide is just some of the things that we were able to get at, using sort of this form that would have been harder to get at in traditional CME. So collaboration, how did they educate others? What were successes? What were challenges? How did their practice actually change? So next slide, please. So I'll end just with that. And based on what we've said, so this is the word cloud part. And I don't know, Scott, how this would work, but we'd like people to answer this question. So if you could go to the poll everywhere and put in if there's any nuggets from this session, or particularly the qualitative piece that you might think that you could apply to your own work, could you just write it in? How do you think you would apply qualitative to your work moving forward if you were? Or it's fair to say, I don't think I will either. I hope that's not the one people say the most, though. So pick and choose, great. Good. Great, wonderful.
The word cloud would have required just one word responses. I just set this up open.
Yeah, thank you. So this is great information.
So we do have one question that came in on the C text line. I know we don't have a lot of time for this section. So this is sort of the common question that comes in. How expensive is it to do qualitative research well?
So there are ways to do it very cost effectively. So people usually think of, studies that take a lot of time or that cost a lot of money when they think of qualitative work. So depending on how you incorporate it, right, it can be easier. There are techniques that I'm happy to talk about online because of the offline, so feel free to contact me. There are techniques that have come up, especially in med ed, more traditional, undergrad or graduate level med ed around using rapid qualitative analysis. So there are techniques to speed it up. The information is usually deeper. So depending on what you do. So there are ways to make it easier. I know that's not really an answer, but it is perceived as taking more time or more money,
Okay.
if that helps.
Great.
And I'm happy to talk about it more if others would like to talk about it later.
And it's worth pointing out that you mentioned the tedium of looking at those responses to open-ended questions. You can use the concatenate function in Excel to generate that, and there are lots of software platforms out there to help with processing quality.
Word clouds, for instance, when they work.
When we've set this up.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're getting a signal from Scott that it's time to move on. So I'm going to invite Charles Rossi to talk about how to create a kick-ass test question.
My own? Okay. I'm very pleased to be here. I've learned quite a bit from my comrades on the panel already. So I am going, can you show the next slide, please, Scott? The next one, where did that come from?
I think this is your case study.
That's the case study, Charles.
Oh, okay. This was something I was going to show as an example of a poorly constructed question. And I'd like you, if you can, to look at it for a short time and try to get an idea what's wrong with this. There are a lot of things wrong with it. And as we go along, I hope to clarify this, to elucidate what's right and what is wrong about the construction of this question. I'm going to go through each part of a question carefully, and given as much time as we have. Can you show the next slide, please?
So the next slide is where people will respond why they think that this is a bad example of multiple choice question. So if you want to have this up, and people can respond on Poll Everywhere as maybe you're reading through this.
Okay. I'm not going to read the whole question. It's a complex question with a lot going on, and I would suggest that you focus especially on what are given as the options, A through D. Supposedly 4 options to this question. There are in fact only 2. If you evaluate it carefully. So what I plan to do in this is to go through, like asthma, change. Yeah, that's exactly right. They do overlap. As I said, there aren't 4 options here. There are only 2. Either you screen the person for liver cancer or you don't. Because you cannot base a question on further information such as based on what. And it's also, each question has multiple parts to it. When you construct a question well, it has a single answer, a single response to a well-framed question. There are a lot of other things that I would have changed in here. It should focus on you as the test taker. Should not be concerned about who this primary care provider is. It's you. The person who is reading the question is the person who is responding. Anything else? It could be worse. Could be a lot of things in there that could be in. I'd have changed a whole lot in that question. I have, just quickly, I worked for about more than 20 years at the American College of Physicians in the self-assessment area, and I've probably reviewed several thousand questions over that time. So you learn a lot about how you can construct a question. There are some basic, not really rules, but more rules of thumb and principles about how to do it. And question, when well constructed, can be an elegant and really a wonderful instrument, integrated instrument for both teaching and for testing. Okay, the question components consist of the following 6 things: the objective, The STEM, STEM is a term of art, which is really a clinical case. The lead-in, which is another term of art. The lead-in is actually the question you ask someone to respond to. The options are the possible responses to the question that you asked. These four components of a question constitute the testing part of a question. The final two are really the teaching aspect of the question. It's a critique, which is a response to the question as a whole. What is the correct answer? Why are the other options not correct? Finally, the evidence. I'll go into the evidence a little bit later. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, educational objective. This will focus the question. It's here are 5 examples. You can see they all start with this is from the aspect of the person taking the exam. These are not learning objectives. So the person who responds to a question, if you get it right, you know how to recognize hypoglycemic unawareness. These are all diabetes questions, by the way. You know how to diagnose something. You know how to manage something, treat something, or evaluate something. These are all forms of actions. They're all verbs. I'll show later that these verbs are going to change into nouns, and this is how the whole question will become integrated. So these are possible educational, where they come from, needs assessment, feeling from physicians about what other physicians don't do well, and surveys. This is where the educational objectives come from. All right, the STEM, which, as I said, is just a clinical case, actually. It's information that enables the educational objective to be realized in a patient. So if you're looking to diagnose diabetic retinopathy, you have to describe a patient in which the symptoms of diabetic retinopathy are integrated. A question should be sensitive with respect to time. This is something I care about a lot. I have to review a lot of these questions, and it's something I always change. By the eternal present, I mean the interaction between the clinician and the patient is occurring now. So so it starts out with what is happening at the moment of their interaction. A lot of people want to write questions that start with 6 months ago, this patient did this, then 4 months ago, this happened, then 2 months ago, and now you start with now. What's happening at the moment, and then you fill in the past history. So a well-constructed clinical case is description of the patient, medical history, physical exam, labs, imaging studies, initial treatment, or management, if that's important to the question. Next one, please. Okay, here's an example. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just describe it. This is an example of a really very, very well-designed clinical STEM. So it's based on the objective that we saw before: manage a severely obese patient with uncontrolled diabetes mellitus. Here he is. It's a still youngish man, 8 years, type 2, severely obese. His disease is uncontrolled, even though he's taking rather intensive therapy. He's taking insulin ×3 and an oral anti-hypoglycemic or oral hypoglycemic twice daily. He measures his blood glucose a lot. He's very concerned here. He participates very much in his own management. His glucose is high today. He also has depression in the past year. He's seen a psychiatrist. Can you go back to the previous slide real quick? The second paragraph there is going into the patient's history. So this is a guy with a lot of medical problems. He also takes a lot of medications. my guess is his medicine cabinet is pretty full. There's a lot going on with this guy. The next one, please. He's also developed depression, but he doesn't take an antidepressive. This, I think, illustrates really well the personal psychological burden of chronic disease in a lot of patients. Diabetes is one of them, COPD is another. But the patient follows his diet carefully, tries to exercise, but can't because he's had foot ulcers and he gets short of breath, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. He's a research chemist and he's concerned that the disease is taking over his whole life. So here you have physical exam. He has a flat affect, but he's responses, breathing through his mouth, sweating. This is a guy who is obviously being deeply affected by the disease. He's here are the his eyes are okay. A few minor hemorrhages in the eyes, no ulceration of the feet. Okay, moving on. All right, the lead-in describes the educational objective in the form of a question. It should be clear and unambiguous, formulate a specific problem, be phrased positively. Now, I mentioned that the verbs in the educational objectives, for example, diagnose something, will become in the lead-in, the question asked, they'll become nouns. So if the educational objective was diagnose something, the question becomes which one of the following is the most likely diagnosis. The second one, which is following up on the patient with diabetes, which one of the following is the most appropriate next step in the management of this patient? Because the educational objective was manage a severely obese patient with uncontrolled diabetes. So we made that patient in the case history, and now in the question we're asking, what do you do to manage this patient? So again, it's diagnosis, management, treatment. Am I getting, okay, moving on.
Yeah, in order to have time for questions, Charles, we've got about a minute left.
Okay, I'll go quickly. Options, they should be consistent, similar in grammar, length, complexity, don't have things like ever, or always, or never. They shouldn't contain extraneous or explanatory material, which is do this because of that. The option is just do this. You don't have all of the above or none of the above. These are no longer be mutually exclusive. All right, the critique provides the rationale for the correct option to the lead-in the context of the educational objective and the clinical case. As I said, this is an integrative approach, and if well done, can be quite elegant, actually. Move on to the next one, please. So I'll go. Okay. How is the question? Has the question that we chose, educational objective, manage a severely obese patient, uncontrolled diabetes, the STEM 42-year-old man, 8-year history of diabetes, lead in, which one of the following is the most appropriate next step in the management of this patient? Options were another drug, continuous monitoring, another oral drug, and refer for evaluation for bariatric surgery, which is the correct answer. Next slide. Okay, the critique. This patient shows the frustration and depression that often accompanies chronic diseases. You're explaining why the choice of bariatric surgery is the correct option in this patient. This can be, this guy is looking for a definitive therapy, not for another drug to add on to an already pretty heavy regimen. This goes on for several paragraphs explaining why. It also shows data, why this is bariatric surgery has been helpful, and the data is based on this article cited as the evidence.
Hey, Charles, we're at the top of our time. Are there any resources that people can turn to in order to help them learn more about test question writing?
there are a lot of online resources to go to the. A lot of universities have. I've gone to Brigham Young University, has a very good program for actually explaining how to do this. Purdue
So that
University is. There are others. I would just do. You can just do a search and they'll come up. There are scads of them.
wonderful. Thank you so much. I know that we're at the top of our time. I want to thank Scott for inviting all these marvelous panelists to address the question of, I know the answer, but what's the question? Thank you to Kathleen, to Mary Ellen, to Asma, and to Charles, and thanks very much to you all for tuning in.
Yes, for those folks watching this session, if there's a brief survey link on the top of the See Me Please Alive tab, just 4 quick questions. And we have one more session with See Me Palooza Spring that you can just look on our live page. And if you want to win money, that is your session to view. So as Alex said, I'd like to thank the panel, like to thank everybody for watching, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple minutes.